Okay, I think most of you know me. My name is Elise Tincher, and I am the Chicago Pro Bono Counsel for Kirkland. Thank you for coming out, and thank you to everyone who is watching this recording and volunteering with election protection. I understand there are double the number of people watching it as who signed up for the in-person training. So, and I think the total number of volunteers right now is around 35 people, which is great because we're hoping to kind of get in the neighborhood of 40 to 50. So, and maybe I'll do a little volunteering, so that'll be 36. Kirkland's really always happy to host election protection events because it's such a great program, and we've been participating in election protection nationwide since 2004. And collectively, Kirkland attorneys and staff have spent over 9,300 hours on election protection. Honestly, it's probably, I mean, after this, it'll probably be up closer to like 9,500, and probably after this year past 10,000. So, we really just do a ton of work with election protection and are very, very proud to be involved in the program. And we do have a little poster over there that was also featured at our Chicago Pro Bono Awards ceremony last week that just talks a little bit more about the program and Kirkland's involvement. So, and the Chicago office's involvement specifically. So if you're curious, please feel free to take a look after the training. So I'm going to turn it over to Ami Gandhi and Ryan Cortazar from the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, who are going to walk you guys through the basics of election protection for when you go volunteer at your polling places on April 4th. Thanks again, everybody, and you just email me, the Kirkland people, if you have any questions, and I'll circulate the billing info after.
Thank you so much to Elise and Kirkland for having us here. This is an incredible partnership, and we definitely couldn't protect voting rights in as robust of a way in as many communities in Illinois without your help. I know that many people will also be watching this training online, but for the people in the room, I'd love to see a show of hands of who has volunteered with election protection before. Great, thanks so much. And please chime in anytime with your ideas and experiences. You can just press the microphone on button at your station anytime that you'd like to participate. We would welcome that. I wanted to start out by sharing with you why we do the work that we do together. Every election in Illinois, whether it's a federal presidential election or a local municipal election like what's coming up in a few days in suburban Cook County and other suburban areas, we see and hear about threats to voting rights. This is a real concern for many of our community members, especially places where demographics are changing quickly over time. Just yesterday during early voting, we received a report from a South suburban community where a slate of candidates was campaigning for themselves by having signs plastered to the outside of what appeared to be a city fire truck and the sound system going with loud messages about who to vote for in the close vicinity of early voting sites in a way that made voters feel uncomfortable about whether they really had the right to vote freely for the candidate of their choice. And I don't want to overstate the problem. That example is not typical of all of our voting experiences. There are many things going right in terms of voter access for voters in Illinois, partly because of the many helpful laws and policies that we have in place to try to ensure access to the polls. But experience shows us that in every single election, at least some voters will experience barriers to the polls. At least some election judges, or in other words, poll workers, will have some gaps in their knowledge and their training and not feel totally sure or comfortable or accurate in their implementation of election law. And so we feel that however small or large the number may be of voters who are disenfranchised, if any voter is improperly turned away from the polls or denied access to vote, that's one too many. And with all of us working together, especially in doing nonpartisan poll monitoring, it's a great program to try to prevent people from being disenfranchised. We want everyone who's eligible to be able to vote, and we believe that this is central to our democracy. We do this in a nonpartisan way, and I want to stress that we're not only nonpartisan on the surface and how we label ourselves, but really in substance too. And that really adds to the strength and credibility of our voter protection work collectively. So then when we get on the phone with Republican county clerks or we get on the phone with Democratic election officials, we are a credible source of information and advocacy because we focus the most on advocating for the voter and where they're coming from, regardless of which candidate or which party they support or oppose. And I should mention that in this particular election, it's actually less about one party versus another, or less about Democrats versus Republicans. There are many libertarian and independent candidates in these municipal elections, and many of the candidates and elected officials switch parties depending on what might be politically strategic at that point in time. And so it's less about one party versus another, but more about protecting voters' rights. And we really appreciate all of your help. For those of you who are in person and watching online, we couldn't do this kind of work without you. We monitored hundreds of polling places in the Chicago metro area and more suburban counties than we've ever monitored before on November 8th because of the partnership of many of you in the private bar. And I'm really grateful that you have many pro bono options to fulfill pro bono requirements, or just out of the goodness of your heart to give time to public interest law. And we really appreciate you choosing to spend time with us. Election Protection is a large nonpartisan voter protection coalition. Chicago Lawyers Committee leads the Illinois part of election protection, but there are advocates and private sector attorneys all over the country doing similar work. Here are some statistics about the impact that we've made on the national level, many calls that we received, and legal volunteers placed all over the country. And in the Illinois call center that many of you interacted with, we received over 1,000 calls on November 8th. All of you this time around for election protection will be serving as field volunteers. We're really grateful for that. So all of us will be serving as nonpartisan poll watcher volunteers, and we will not have a hotline this time around. And so when field volunteers or voters or election judges, election officials, really anyone else involved with voting, if there are questions or concerns to report at any time, the best way to do that is to contact Chicago Lawyers Committee, and you'll see our phone number. Our phone numbers plastered all over the materials, our office numbers, as well as our cell phone numbers. And at the time when it's convenient, you should make sure to put that into your cell phone so that it's convenient for you to contact us anytime. And that two-way communication ends up being a really robust way to protect voting rights. So not only do we have eyes and ears all over the suburban areas where we will be doing poll watching, but also through the communication and all of you keeping in touch with us when urgent issues arise or to let us know how you resolved a problem on the spot, we're able to then continue our advocacy to county clerks, to election officials, to others in the case that there is an intervention needed, or even in the rare occurrence where legal or litigation intervention is needed. Because of that two-way communication, we're able to address it. And what happens in the vast majority of situations is that we are able to resolve voting rights issues on the spot in our election protection work in Illinois, which is unique, and it's, again, only possible with your partnership. Most of you will be serving as field volunteers in suburban Cook County, and you will receive addresses for the specific polling places to monitor. And you'll be receiving that by the end of this week. Anyone should contact me if you have questions in the meantime. And there will be a few individuals who are doing poll watching in DuPage and Will County because of the community need there. And if others are interested in those areas, they should make sure to contact us. And within suburban Cook County, the locations for our field volunteering are based, and for all of the geographic location assignments, it's based on where is the community need, where have there been chronic issues with barriers to the polls, where have nonpartisan civic groups let us know that they need help from attorneys and advocates in protecting voting rights. These are often areas, as I mentioned before, it's not so much about one party versus another party politically, but it's actually more so voter protection issues are coming up because of entrenched power versus a challenger coming in and trying to change the system. Oftentimes, these local elections are decided based on a slim margin of victory, where even a few votes really do make the difference between who wins and who loses. And we hear from many people that there's a lot at stake, not only the paid position for that elected official, but oftentimes that elected official has power over appointing other people to the payroll and maintaining power and a livelihood in other ways. And so that's why these local elections are really important and ultimately important for the communities who are served through these government systems. And all of you have signed up for a specific volunteer shift. If anyone has questions about your shift or your timing, please contact me about that afterward. And most people will be paired up so that in most cases, a returning election protection volunteer will be paired up with a new election protection volunteer. And for the few instances where a volunteer may be serving by themselves, they can also always contact us over the phone if we can ever be of support that way. And the polls are open from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. That's the reason for the super long volunteer shifts. And it's really important for us to try to have as much of a presence in these elections as we can. So we appreciate volunteers arriving on time. And it's important to set the stage so that everyone in the polling place understands who we are and why we're there, particularly to introduce ourselves to the poll workers, or the other term for it is election judges, the people working at the polls. We should explain that we're a nonpartisan volunteer. It's fine to say that we are with Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. There's a credential, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that's a piece of paper that looks like this that allows us to be in the polls as a poll watcher. And some of it has been filled out for you, and then some of the specifics like your name, the address of the polling place will be up to you to fill it out later. Any questions about that, let us know. And then your main role there is to not just observe the process, to be a resource, to be helpful. If you overhear voters having questions about what is and is not allowed at the polls, or what kind of resources they may have access to, what kind of help they can get, it's fine to answer that question. It's a best practice to do so such that the election judge can also hear you, so that it should be all be transparent. And we can also be a helpful resource to the election judges themselves. Some of these personnel were trained a long time ago. There have been some legal and social changes since that time. And so we actually may know about some aspects of voter access and election law where we could be a helpful resource to the election judge. We talked about the importance of assisting voters, and we talked about the importance of the information that all of you have coming back to Chicago Lawyers Committee. So you are the eyes and ears for election protection. And when you identify and report problematic practices, you may be resolving it on the spot through your advocacy. You may have questions for us about the strategy of how to do so. And that kind of information gathering is really important. The types of questions that you may get from voters, a few of them are listed here. We'll go into more details about that soon. One of the things that comes up often is checking voters' registration status and polling place information. And we'll share with you the link. It's in your materials, and that's something you may, if you have a mobile device, you may want to bookmark it on your phone, because that's one of the types of questions you could get on election day in a way that you could meaningfully help a voter. Here are a few ideas about how to politely and proactively ask voters if they have any questions or issues. Now, this kind of approach works really well when it's super crowded and there are long lines and there might be a lot of voters standing outside a polling place who we are interacting with. In the April 4th election, long lines and overcrowding is less likely to be a problem, but the protection of voters' rights is equally, if not more, of an issue in this election as compared to other elections. So you'll want to strike a balance between being helpful, but of course, if there's just a small trickle of voters coming in, we don't need to be loud and disruptive to the process if things are going fine. And it's fine for us to just make it clear to the voter we're there if they do need help, without being overly intrusive or interrupting their ability to vote or interfering with the secrecy of who they're voting for. So we handed out to all of you election protection buttons you can feel free to wear that can identify who you are and distinguish you from being involved with any party or candidate, and just show that you're a neutral person in case people do have questions. And when you see problems that rise to a level of something that you do want to report sooner, I'm going to take a question.
Yeah. Amy, can you comment further on what you just said about the secrecy of who they're voting for? Because when I was monitoring last time, some of the elderly wanted help in reading the ballot if they didn't have their reading glasses. There was one person who 3 times her hand was shaking, so she kept filling in the box outside of the lines, and finally, to avoid the problem, asked if somebody could fill in the box for her.
Sure.
So how far can we go to help someone vote while at the same time avoiding the secrecy issue of knowing who they're voting for?
Thank you for the helpful question. Any voter has the right to receive assistance if they need help with the physical act of voting. It may be for a reason of a health issue. In your example that you gave, it may be because of a language barrier or another issue. And we are permitted to help them under the law. It is the best practice to loop in the election judge so that the person working there understands what we're doing and why. In many jurisdictions, there's a form we then have to fill out as an assister. It's a short affidavit saying, I'm helping this person vote. They are choosing who to vote for. I'm just helping them with the physical act of voting. And also, I believe that it has language about keeping the information secret. So we would still keep it secret, even if in the act of helping physically, we ended up finding out how a person voted. And then I would contrast that with a situation where someone did not ask for help and didn't need help. In that situation, we should allow them to vote privately. And when we as poll watchers do run into issues that require immediate attention, and you'll hear about what types of issues those are very soon from my colleague Ryan, here are phone numbers that you can keep handy. It's in all of your materials as well. And we encourage you to call us if you have any questions about how to navigate something in the polling place while you're also advocating to election judges and trying to be helpful to voters. It may be more convenient for you to text us, and that's totally fine too. These couple numbers are cell phone numbers. You can also email us anytime. And in your paperwork, you do have incident logs that can help you if you want to take notes about something, particularly if it's not time sensitive or if you tried to get through to us and you couldn't. And if you just wanted to make sure to jot down information, there is a place for you to do that. And we just can't stress enough that we really want that data. We want that information from you. So whether we heard about it from you on the spot or you shared it with us later that same day or the next morning, we log it all into a database, and we really appreciate your input. This is a little bit of information about why reporting data is important. And so in addition to allowing us to resolve these voter access barriers on the spot, which there are countless examples of how we were able to do that on the spot on November 8th, for example, because of getting great input from field volunteers. And for example, if an election judge needed to be removed, if they were doing something very egregious, we could advocate for that on the spot because of having the proper details from all of you, from the eyes and ears of our election protection program. The data can also help us to identify broader trends, especially when we have those stories in aggregate. And as much data as you can gather, that will be helpful for us to know. And at the minimum, we need to know from you the polling place of where you are located. Many of you will be going to multiple polling places throughout your volunteer shift, so don't take it for granted that we necessarily know where you are at a given point in time. And the way that it works in suburban communities is that we would need to know from you the name of the township and the name of the precinct within the township. This is a typo, I apologize for that. So we need to know the township name and then the precinct number. And it also can't hurt to give us the name and address of the location, like if you're at the Calumet City Public Library, or just the common sense name and address. But especially the township name and the precinct number is going to be helpful for us to then escalate the issue to the authorities if needed. And any other details that you think in your common sense assessment that we would need to know to follow up with the appropriate officials. So if the problem is a problematic election judge, then we would want to know their name or description, for example. Here's a quick list of what to bring with you for your volunteer shift. So you have the handy button with you. You have a lot of the documents in the packet that are mentioned here, top issues and FAQs. The credentials are what allow you to be in the polling place. You have plenty of extra in case you left one at one of the polling places and needed to move on to the next place. And please also consider bringing a phone, a charger, be comfortable. You'll be there for a long time. I think we have a question over here.
Actually, on the credentials, because a lot of the locations actually have multiple precincts in them, you may be going to 3 or 4. This happened to me in November, which
Yes.
is why I'm bringing it up. 3 or 4 locations, but each of those have 3 or 4 precincts in them. If we get the list and require more, like I ran out because certain locations were very strict that every precinct within one location, you had to give a credential there. Is there someplace we can get additional credentials if looking at it, we might need it?
We'll definitely keep that in mind when giving assignments, and thanks for pointing that out. And actually at Kirkland would be the perfect place through Sabrina West to get the extra credentials. And then we'll keep that in mind too when we give people credentials going forward, to give them more just to be safe. So thank you for the input. We have plenty of credentials, so anyone should let us know. And once people go through training with us, it's completely fine for us to give people credentials. And just plan on being at the polling place or at other polling places for a long time. So these other tips are what to bring so that you can be comfortable and prepared. Make sure that you feel free to give us a call anytime if we can be helpful, if Ryan or myself can be helpful. Don't be political. And often this comes up when when a field volunteer is provoked into it. So it may not come from one of us necessarily having an agenda or having a preference about who wins or loses in a suburban municipal race. But if other people who are charged around this issue, as many voters and community members are, might ask us our opinion about something, not just on a candidate, but also on an issue. There may be a referendum question or another issue about education, for example, that's coming up in the discussion around a school board election that we may get asked about. And it's just important to stay firm and to not take a side, to not support or oppose a particular issue or stance or candidate or party. The next point talks about it being important to not establish an attorney-client relationship. So we don't represent the voters who we're helping. I think we're all on board with that and all on the same page about that. It can be helpful to let election judges know that we're volunteer attorneys working with a civil rights organization that's nonpartisan, and that's fine to mention. It's just important for us to not hold ourselves out as an attorney representing a voter, especially in our interaction with the voter. And then before I pause and take a question, I just want to wrap up this section by saying it's important for us to be polite and constructive, kind of navigating the line between being proactive and being assertive about our stance on voters' rights and access, but not with the goal of getting into an argument or winning a legal debate, but more so to be there to help the voter. And oftentimes in the context of advocating to an election judge, the most effective way to do that can be to start from a place of collaboration and start from a place of trying to work with the election judge in a collegial way. And many of the voting rights issues can be resolved that way. So I'll take a quick question and then turn it over to my colleague, Ryan. So can you point out to me what part your question is about? Mm-hmm. We'll give you all the information that you need to complete the credential, yes. And anytime people have questions, let us know. Thank you. And I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Ryan Cortazar.
Hi, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the resources, which are the materials that you have in front of you to help you really orient yourself to how you're going to provide help to voters on election day, as well as election law basics, which are really what's summarized in those materials that you have. So let's start with the resources that you have. There's one which is the top issues and FAQs. You also have state or county websites because we live in the age of technology, so you have you can use your smartphones. And then as a last resource, you have Ami and myself who are willing to help you advocate for voters on election day. To clarify, top issues is a one-page document, so that's going to be your first line of defense. That's going to have the things that we've identified as the problems that you're most likely to come face-to-face with. The FAQs are more in-depth. They have citations to the Illinois compiled statutes, which you might actually end up using. A lot of times we'll have to present those to election judges if they are questioning the information that we have. Another thing is, I mentioned before, is this is the link that Ami mentioned as well. It's ova.elections.il.gov. And so if you have your phones, you might not want to have time to do that now, but right now, because registration is closed, you're not going to be able to look up voters' information right away. But at the top of it, this is the desktop version, but even at the top of the mobile version is a click to see, am I registered to vote in Illinois? And so through that, you can get voters' information, put them into the system, and try to figure out what their registration status is. Because that's going to determine what the substance is of the advice that you're going to give them. Because in general, if they're not registered, you're going to give them information related to election day registration. The second is the county clerk websites. Because of budget constraints, but also administrative problems, sometimes the Illinois website might not be up to date. So say you look up a voter and the voter says, that seems wrong to me. I registered to vote a few days ago. What you might want to do is also look at the county websites. We didn't provide the direct links on this site because a lot of times the addresses are just too long. So if you just Google the website for the clerk for your county, you'll be able to find that information. And through there, you'll be able to navigate the registration information as well. So right now, we're going to do a few questions from the top issues to field and from the FAQ document. So if you take those out in front of you, we'll try to get through a couple of these questions. So the first one is, what ID do I need to vote? And so what we'll do is we'll just go down the line. So for the first gentleman in the front row, what ID is necessary to vote in Illinois? Oh, so if you look at the top issues to field, yeah, it should be in there.
Or anyone else who wants to
Or anyone
chime
else,
in.
yeah, sorry to put you on the spot. Yeah. So this is just to help you orient yourself to navigate the best way to find the answers to these questions. Right, so what IDs are necessary? Right, that's right. So in most cases, they will not need to vote to provide an ID. If they registered to vote and they provided proof of that, of their address in that process, then they won't need an ID. They will need an ID if, say, they registered by mail and they don't have a driver's license, so the state or the official is not able to independently verify that. The second question is, they request a mail-in ballot, but didn't send in, can they vote? This is one that we actually saw quite a bit of on Election Day because these procedures can change from, although the law doesn't change, the procedures can change from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Yes. Okay, great. Right. So yeah, so that's actually a really great anecdote. We'll probably use that in future trainings because it also intersects with the problems that we have with provisional ballots. So what they probably wanted to do is to give you a provisional ballot, and we warn people that that in many instances they're not counted. This also varies by jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions are willing to count all provisional ballots if after the fact they find that the person did not vote, they didn't receive the mail-in ballot in the mail a few days after the election. But in some cases, that's right, they won't be voted unless there's a close election. And for good reasons, many voters are not comfortable with that. So in general, what you can do is if you did receive it, what you can tell the voter is you can bring back the ballot or part of the ballot. You can also say that I never received it, and you might be able to sign an affidavit at the polling place saying I never received it and I want to vote for the first time. So it's an open question, and that's probably a good reason to call us, because we've had these conversations with the election authorities to try to persuade them to give people full or a standard ballot and not a provisional ballot, so that it'll be counted on election day. Right.
It's an open question. I would say for the purpose of this training to remember to encourage voters that if they can bring it in up the whole, or it's best to bring it in
Right.
if they can.
Yeah. So the Attorney General has one view of this, and some election authorities have other views of this. And that's one thing that we're trying to advocate for. The last one, Ami brought up a little bit differently. My father doesn't speak English. May I assist him in voting? Yeah, that's right. So anyone for any reason can have somebody assist them in voting as long as they're willing to sign an affidavit. So these are reasons why you want to call or text us. We've already kind of gone over some of those because of the nature of this conversation. But electioneering, which is where people have seem like they're advocating for one candidate or the other. Another is if there's intimidating flyers or police presence. Broken machines. Now, there are two different types of broken machines. There are broken ballot counters as well as broken ballot casters. So depending on where you are, depending on the technology, this was also a major problem that we had on November 8th. So many of these machines are really old and they break down with surprising frequency. And that's one thing that I think that election jurisdictions, when they have the money, are really trying to update, because some of them are 20 years old. Poll workers giving the wrong information, we also want to know about, because what we can do is we can report that to the election authorities, let them know that this is a problematic judge. They might get a mark against them, which will discourage them from being poll workers in the future. Multiple voters reporting they're not on the rolls. Again, this is another problem that we had a lot of on election day, and this is really a technological issue. Some of the poll books are not as reliable as the election judges think they are, and that can lead to the next problem. If there's a high use of provisional ballots, sometimes there's a technological issue. We also had problems where election day registration is still a pretty new thing in Illinois. And so in the past, if somebody wasn't registered, what you might have is that somebody would be given a provisional ballot and say afterwards you can provide proof of your registration or proof of your residence, and then you can vote. Now that should be highly discouraged. So if somebody's giving out provisional ballots to people for the reason that they're not registered, we want to know about that, because that's another systemic problem that goes to the training that jurisdiction is giving. Sure. So if somebody is at the polling place and they're not registered, or the election judge says they're not registered, and they want to give them a provisional ballot, that signals a problem to us, because they can actually register on election day to cast a normal ballot. Also, polls open late or close early. It's so funny. These are all things that this training is a little bit older, but they're all things that we had real issues with on election day. Polls open late all the time, unfortunately, but it's a very temporary workforce. There are a ton of polling places, which is really to the benefit of this community, that we don't generally have lines that you see in other jurisdictions. But with that, you're going to have people showing up not on time or not really ready to deal with the equipment issues that they're going to present when they have to. It might take an hour to set up. And then finally, voters who don't speak English and voters with disabilities having issues. That's another problem that we want to know about, because that's very important to address with the election authorities. Yes.
On the not on the rolls issue, with the expansion of early voting, what I saw is that a lot of confusion about thinking that you can go to the early voting location on election day and vote there, even if it is no longer your polling place.
Right.
And so I think some of the issues with showing up is not on the rolls, well, you're not showing up on the rolls for that particular precinct. It just happens to be your early voting location. So I just wanted to flag that as another issue and something to educate the election judges. When I saw it before, they were all knowledgeable about it, but in November, I used that website to tell people where to go more than I did anything else.
That's really great information as well, and that's something that we've been in discussions with election authorities, because in Chicago they want to create some super sites that they have for early voting, but they also want to do them on election day because so many voters, particularly working people, aren't able to get to their polling place, which might be by their home if they have a long commute. And so that's something that is in the works and something that we are in general in favor of, but we also don't want that to result in them closing precincts in order to accommodate that need. That's a really great point to make. Now we're going to go over some election law basics. We've actually gone over a good amount of that just in the course of our conversation. This is the terminology. Poll workers and election judges, those are used interchangeably. Poll watchers is something different. That's what you are. They can be nonpartisan. There are also people from campaigns, and particularly in local elections, we've heard anecdotal information about those poll watchers. They can be points of friction on election day because, like you, sometimes they're actually instructing the election judges on the election law if they're not trained very well. They can also, that's a really important role that they also might be challenging voters more because that might make a difference here. Most voters who vote in person vote by paper ballot. There are also going to be machines for accessibility. So there are, do they have Braille voting machines?
Yeah, they have electronic voting machines that can accommodate people with different accessibility needs, but also anyone can use those electronic machines, and some people just choose to use them even aside from a health or language issue.
Right, so that's another important point to make, is that a lot of the voting machines can assist in language assistance as well. So if the election judges aren't aware of the tools that they have at their disposal, that'll be helpful. Provisional ballots we've discussed, they're a fail-safe ballot, and as we mentioned, too often they're not counted. And election day registration we also talked about. Sometimes it's called same-day registration. Another important thing to note is it's sometimes called grace period registration, which only is used by people who have like very technical knowledge because it deals with the state statute. So it might be that there's an election judge who received a training where they talk about grace period registration. That's a term you might want to use if they're unfamiliar or don't know what election day registration is. And finally, this is available in all counties. There's a question as to whether or not it should be required in smaller counties that don't have the technologies or the budgets to accommodate this instant type of checking that is available when you have electronic poll books. But everywhere we'll be sending people, they'll have that. These are the main issues that we're going to deal with. I think we've talked about most of them because a lot of times they are systemic issues that we're going to want to know about. So as we mentioned, challenges to voters, that's not necessarily a systemic problem. Electioneering is not necessarily a systemic problem. It just depends on the frequency with which we're seeing them. So the poll worker says, I'm not registered. I think we've pretty much gone over that. And for the sake of time, so we can answer your questions, I think we're just going to move forward. An important one is felony convictions, and this is one that we've been working on quite a bit. In general, people who have been convicted of felonies may vote as long as they're not on work release or on furlough. So if they're on probation, they can vote. We've heard anecdotal information in the last month that sometimes parole officers themselves have informed voters that they're not able to vote if they're on parole. So that's a common point of misinformation, and it's something that might come up in these elections. I'm not exactly sure. It's a term of... Go ahead. Yes. Okay, that's funeral, sure.
And so just to clarify that point in case anyone encounters this, so if a person has completed a sentence and is on parole or probation, the law in Illinois says that the person is eligible to vote. They may have been kicked off of the voter rolls, though, from back when they were incarcerated, so they may need to use election day registration or another tool to get back on the rolls. And I also wanted to point out the first bullet point was to your point, the great question you asked earlier, is that the first thing to ask if a person isn't on the books there is where are you registered to vote, and to try to help them with that.
And And also, if they were in jail and they just got out and they're awaiting sentence, obviously they can still vote. We've basically gone over these IDs. And I think that these go. IDs only necessary for first-time voters. We've gone through that. And here's a list of forms of acceptable IDs. Basically, Illinois is a very broad ID state. Almost anything that has some semblance of authenticity can be used. Yes? That's right. It doesn't need to have a picture in Illinois. And only one form has to match the address. So, we live in Chicago and Cook County, highly mobile populations. So it does not need to match their address, because a lot of people don't want to pay the fee to change the address, because it can get expensive. As long as they have like a utility bill and those are two forms of ID that would be acceptable. And both of them don't have to have the address. However, if the ID has an expiration date, that's not going to be valid. That's an important thing to keep in mind. This is what happens. This is some specific advice on what happens if machines are broken. This is something to keep in mind. Number of machine, type of machine. Again, because you'll be calling us, you probably don't need to put that in so strongly. The first is I have a disability. I think we've gone through this as well. So here are the different options, though. So you can have a fully accessible polling place. This is actually mandated, but unfortunately it's not uniform across the board because precincts change so frequently and a lot of our building stock is older. It's not ADA compliant. So curbside voting is available. That means that the election judge can bring the ballot out to the voter who can vote in their car if that's an option for them, and also personal assistance. And the only restrictions on that, it can't be a representative of their employer or of their union. I think we've also gone with this. So there are three types. Translated and written materials, bilingual judges. A lot of the places we'll be sending you will probably have translated written materials or bilingual judges. If it seems like they don't have that, but there's a high need, you should also consider calling us in that circumstance too, because that'll be important for future elections, that they know that there's been this shift in their population. If you're in Will County, though, then maybe not. Also personal translation assistance. This is about electioneering. I think we've gone over that. The 100 feet rule is an important thing to know. So a lot of people think that that there's improper or illegal electioneering going on. It might be improper, but it's not illegal if it's so long as it's outside of 100 feet. So in this election, because there's probably likely to be multiple precincts in the same location, just because they're not expecting the same turnout and it's easy on their resources, the 100 feet rule is generally from the door to the voting room and not from the exterior door. So it might be that if you're in a large high school, there are people milling about in a lobby with these materials as long as they're outside of 100 feet from the door into the polling room. Yeah.
And typically a cone will show that zone, and inside the cone is considered a campaign-free zone, and then outside electioneering or campaigning is allowed. And I was wondering if our returning volunteer can share a story about something that was annoying but still legally permissible.
Yeah, one of the candidates was standing outside the cone, but yelling loud enough so that people walking into the door were able to hear him. And, while it might have been rude and offensive, and my personal view is I hope it cost him a few votes, but, he was outside the cone and there was nothing that could be done about it. Yes,
the cone could be in the building. And in local elections, this noise issue, the audio advertising and campaigning, it does come up quite frequently with megaphones and vehicles with sound systems, and we've received reports of that in numerous suburban communities over the years and even in this election. And so it's something to watch out for. And we are still advocates, and we should still advocate to election judges if we feel like something is happening that's intimidating or pressuring voters one way or another.
Yeah, and that's because the volunteers who were at the site in November, we were talking about whether his yelling at people as they were coming in was intimidating. And even though he was outside the cone, the thought was that if the words he was yelling cross the line towards intimidation rather than things like, hey, glad to see you here today, thanks for coming out. Then we probably would have told him he needed to either go further back or stop what he was doing. But he wasn't yelling intimidating type words. He was just being loud and obnoxious.
And so this is another issue that comes up. You're not allowed to wear any political clothing or buttons in the polling place. So generally what we have is if you have a jacket, you can put a jacket on over it or take the button off. I think we also have an example of where the borderline is on this. Do you want to share that as well?
Yeah, in November we had another situation where someone came in NRA attire. There was no hat, shirts, buttons, or anything indicating a candidate name or a party name, but it was rather clear who the individual was going to support based on the NRA T-shirts and hat that he was wearing. Again, there was discussion amongst the judges and the volunteers and a conclusion that it was not something we would tell him to cover up. But there was monitoring of whether he was trying to advocate within the room, and he kept his mouth shut. He didn't say anything to anybody. He was just wearing NRA paraphernalia, and the conclusion was that was permissible since he too didn't use words to try and intimidate anyone.
Yeah, great. And so another issue is selfies, which might actually be an issue in this election because of the razor-thin margins of votes. In general, I think our stance is that selfies are permitted, but they're not. We do not want people taking photos of their ballots, of their completed ballots, because those can be bought and sold. And we've seen that not necessarily around here, but I've heard anecdotal information from places in, like for utility commissions in Kentucky. Yes.
Sorry about that. Thanks. I've heard of vote buying happening as well. And, even before people had selfies happening, I've also read that there are cases holding that people have a First Amendment right to take selfies, including of their ballots.
Right.
If we see this going on, what's your suggestion about what we do?
I think that's our suggestion, is that it might be appropriate, but not to take a picture of the ballot itself. So I think it's okay for people to take photos of themselves voting in the polling place or to take photos of the polling place. We generally advise them not to take photos of other people voting, but not to take photos of the ballots themselves. There's been like a split, I think, in terms of what courts have ruled, whether or not it's a First Amendment issue. I think the ACLU is on one side, and the Sixth Circuit seems to be leaning toward the other. I don't know that it's come up here, but
It's anticipated that there could be future Illinois legislation on this to clear up the gray area. But for now, we would recommend the advice that Ryan gave to encourage people to be excited about civic engagement, take a selfie outside the polling place or of their wristband or a little paper that says I voted. That those are all really great things, and stay away from taking a photo of your ballot.
And if we see somebody who's taking a photo of their ballot or about to, what would you suggest we do?
I would suggest to start by talking to the election judge and saying it loudly enough that anyone else could hear, but really utilizing them as part of the solution about what could be a better practice within the polling place and would help everyone to be comfortable there. Because we're coming at it from the point of view of we want everyone to feel comfortable who's voting there, to vote freely for the person of their choice. And the more that happens, it stands to make people within the polling place or people who view the picture uncomfortable. And so we would come at it from that point of view, that we're trying to assist voters by bringing up this point.
yeah.
Thank you.
All right. So I know we're running short on time, so I think we've gone over this basically on the earlier slide. And so here's a practice. So do we want to run the simulation, or do we just want to do Q&A since we're short on time? Okay. Sure. Okay. All right. So are there any, and this is our issue, our process. So this just shows you the work that the work that you do contributes to the work that we do all year round, not just, even though we have elections in Illinois every single year, it still goes forward. So these are the actions that we've taken: litigation, administrative reform, legislative reform, and community outreach. Final reminders, there are our phone numbers again. So are there any questions?
I do want to back up a little bit, and a couple slides back, we talked about challenges. And so by that, it's a bit of a jargon term that is referring to when a voter is challenged about their right to be there or their eligibility to vote or their registration status. And so that's something to keep in mind, especially if we see it, could we go back to that slide really quickly?
Yeah.
If we see it happen multiple times, or it's not just that an election judge might challenge voters' right to be there. It could be a partisan poll watcher. It could be someone like us, but instead of being nonpartisan like us with a campaign asserting that voters who seem like they might vote a certain way, or in a lot of the small towns, people kind of know each other and might know who the voter is affiliated with or might tend to vote for. And if we see that kind of behavior happening where a partisan poll watcher or someone else is trying to discredit many different voters and discourage them from participating, that's a situation where we would want to bring that to the attention of the election judge and say, I think that something unfair is happening here. Of course, people can call us too if they see it happening. And we would encourage you, if you see this happening, if you see other kinds of intimidating behavior, whether it's by police officers, I mentioned to you the example of a fire truck, or other people who are connected with real or perceived authority figures and are making voters feel uncomfortable. We want you all to be safe and comfortable first and foremost. So bring it to our attention. Let us know how we can help you. Seek help from an election judge or an election authority. We never want you to be in an unsafe situation. So you don't have to get into a confrontation directly, but by being the eyes and ears of election protection, you can still add tremendous value in helping us figure out what to do next to address the problem. Can you turn your microphone on? Thank you.
I'm not sure how I will know whether or not it's an illegitimate challenge or a legitimate challenge. You know, how am I going to be able to detect that? See what I'm saying? I mean,
If a partisan poll watcher, for example, or an election judge asserted that a voter shouldn't be there and did that a bunch of times for different voters, our role would be to suggest to another election judge there, or either the election judge, if it was the case of a partisan poll watcher causing trouble, or another election judge, because there are always going to be more than one there. Can you check that person's voter registration status if it's a question mark for us, if we don't necessarily feel like we should take the word of the person who's saying that the voter is ineligible, we should ask someone else to verify. And that would be one way to try to get some support and also to assess, is this a one-off thing? Is it an actual error? Maybe the person is actually ineligible. Asking some of those questions will help us to sort out whether it's something nefarious going on or whether there was nothing improper about it.
so what you're looking for is a pattern.
A pattern, and then also us having eyes on the process and asking these questions, I think can also reduce and deter the improper behavior or challenges. So we are looking for a pattern, but we're also looking to just be vigilant in observing the process and showing that we expect and insist that fair election procedures are followed.
I had another question, and that is, there are only two of you, and there are a lot of polling places, you know, and it's a cell phone, right? So what if we don't get through? I mean, you say call immediately, and you're going to do something about it, but what if we don't get through? Do we just keep calling and calling and calling until you answer the phone? Or?
I think calling and texting us would be a good idea. I also want to make sure that everyone knows that we're talking about the worst case scenarios here. And there are many instances where things go smoothly and voters have a positive experience. And we hope that that will be the case for many of the voters. There's not an expectation of overcrowding and being bombarded by a million voter questions or problems on April 4th. It's not going to be the same level of turnout as November 8th, for example. And so we do feel like it will be feasible. And we also are not covering every polling place in suburban Cook County or in Illinois. We're focusing on places where we've heard community input about ongoing barriers to civic engagement and barriers at the polls. And so we are, as a team together, we're being targeted about the areas where we think we can make a positive impact. So we feel comfortable with this setup, and we're really excited to hear from you on April 4th. And as people, I wonder if a returning election protection volunteer could chime in, even though municipal elections are a little bit different and they're going to be lighter traffic and a little bit slower and possibly in some parts of the day more boring than doing election protection on November 8th. But I wonder if a returning volunteer could say did you get more comfortable over the duration of your shift in terms of gauging when to call something in or not, or any other insights you'd like to share?
I think what I did in November was tried to spend like 20 minutes, visit each place at the beginning of my shift and spend like 15 to 20 minutes there. And it gives you a sense of how it's going. There was one precinct in particular. It was actually the place where they insisted, no, there are 2 precincts in this room and you have to have a credential for each of them. And they knew their stuff backwards and forwards. I mean, even there was a new election judge and she had everything prepared and doing everything. So I think you watch and kind of see, you can tell who knows what they're doing and who doesn't, and you get a sense of where they're likely to be problems. And then you can allocate your time best based on kind of that first assessment of things.
Yeah, I agree with that. The election judges were very, very competent and knew their stuff and were operating like a well-oiled machine. And what I found is that as a first-time volunteer back in November, pretty quickly got comfortable with the process and what was going on. You'll see, that it really does get going pretty easily, and your role, fairly early on. And the other thing that I will say is that as the day wore on, almost as every hour went by, the process became more and more satisfying, and I really felt like, I'm making a difference here. And, there was a feeling at the end of the day that this was a very, very valuable and worthwhile experience, and role that I played today. And I really did feel at the end of the day that I made a difference by being there, and that's one of the reasons I'm back for this election, because the process is something that I think you'll find very rewarding. We make a difference inside those precincts.
Since I'm not really experienced with this, who generally are the election judges? Where do they come from? What's their background?
So by law, they're required to have like one Republican and one Democrat in each polling place. But in general, I think they're just members of the community who happen to live in those precincts. Sometimes they don't live in the precincts, so sometimes they have to go outside to recruit them. But it's basically not that different probably from the pool of people who do poll watching. It's people who are interested in the democratic process. It's also, some of them have been doing it for a really long time too. So although there are some younger ones and some high school students who are involved in it, some of them, if they've been or have been members of their community for a long time, and they work as an election judge every year.
Sometimes the people who are part of that really vital workforce, as Ryan mentioned, were recruited and trained originally a long time ago, and not only has technology changed since then, and there are lots of iterations of new machines and procedures, like election day registration is still relatively new, and some judges are still getting the hang of that and still getting the hang of the fact that this is a part of the law now. This is a part of all of our right to be able to access this. And we also have had some legal changes to the landscape, even technology aside, since the time that some of the personnel became election judges. So new federal civil rights requirements about language access for certain populations and other things. And then because of those laws and requirements kicking in, then we have some relatively new citizens and newer arrivals and younger people who are election judges too. So it's an interesting and diverse workforce with people coming from different walks of life. There's some amount of refresher training required, but it's very quick and still leaves something to be desired for some of the jurisdictions and just so many people that in practice it's inconsistent as far as what the takeaway was of how comfortable someone is with the new changes.
Yeah, and so that actually kind of brings up, ties into your earlier question, I think was really important. If you're not able to get a hold of us, I think that we'll be able to get a hold of us, but through text or through voicemail if we don't answer our phones. But also what you might want to do is if you think that something maybe doesn't rise to the level of I need help right now, or maybe we're not available because something happens, just if you write down in your notes what happened, maybe email us or send us that information later. Because after Election Day, we generally will meet with the election authorities to talk about issues that we saw out in the field. And in those meetings, it's extremely helpful to know the ward, precinct, township, all that information. But also sometimes if you're able to get an election judge's name, that can also be very useful.
And in a few rare cases, we would never want you or a voter to be uncomfortable, but it may make sense to get a voter's name and contact information, such as if someone was improperly turned away from the polls and it just wasn't, you tried to advocate, you tried to talk to the election judge, it wasn't getting resolved right then and there. It always helps to ask if the person is comfortable giving their name and phone number, and then in many instances, we've been able to contact the person on the same day and after the situation is ironed out, and they have actually been able to vote on the day of through the quick work of the field volunteer and our staff. And so when it seems appropriate, like it could make a difference on that day, please do ask for a name and number if the person's willing. If they're not willing, then we just leave it at that and no harm done. And that can, we're not just, we have a very much a problem solving model, and there are many instances when there are barriers that we're together able to solve them.
Yeah, and if they ask if they want to, if giving us our information, we're going to hand it over to the government, or in general, we always call the voter first before we escalate it to the election authorities to make sure that they're comfortable if we think that that information will be helpful in our advocacy. All right.
Thank you all so much. We'll be here for a few more minutes if anyone has questions. Stay tuned for an email from us by the end of the week with the specific volunteer assignment locations. Most people will be in suburban Cook County. One or two people will be in DuPage and Will, and we really look forward to working with you all. Thank you for your dedication.
Thanks.